Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten back roads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. Yellowstone National Park, America's first wilderness preserve, spans nearly 3,500 square miles of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Within its boundaries lie geothermal features, diverse wildlife, and forests that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. But beyond the designated trails and tourist areas exists what park employees simply call the Forbidden Zone regions, so remote, dangerous, or inexplicably strange that access is restricted to all but the most essential personnel. Tonight, we examine 8 verified encounters between Yellowstone Park rangers and phenomena that defy conventional explanation. These are not legends passed down through generations, but documented incidents from official reports, recorded testimony, and internal Park Service communications. The witnesses are trained observers, men and women skilled in wilderness survival, wildlife behavior, and natural phenomena. Yet even they could not explain what they experienced in those isolated regions where cellular signals disappear and radio communications become unreliable. The stories span several decades and multiple seasons, yet share common threads: unexplained sounds, impossible movements, and a profound sense of being watched by something that does not belong in our natural world. Each encounter left its mark on those who experienced it, altering their understanding of the wilderness they had dedicated their lives to protecting. These accounts remind us that even in our most mapped and studied territories, mysteries endure, pockets of the unknown where something ancient and patient still moves just beyond our comprehension. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was late September of 2003 when Ranger Daniel Mitchell first encountered what would later be documented in Yellowstone Incident Report 03B742. Mitchell had been with the National Park Service for 12 years, spending the last 6 in Yellowstone's Backcountry Division. His assignment that week involved surveying trail conditions in the remote Lamar Valley region, an area known for its bison herds and occasional wolf sightings. The Forbidden Zone in question was a 5-square-mile section of the valley where unusual geological activity had been reported for decades, areas where ground temperatures fluctuated unpredictably, and where compasses often malfunctioned. Mitchell had entered the zone at dawn, documenting coordinates and taking soil samples as part of a long-term environmental study. The morning passed uneventfully as he worked his way deeper into the restricted area, his GPS device marking his progress while his radio remained silent, standard procedure for minimizing electromagnetic interference in the geologically unstable region. By early afternoon, Mitchell had reached the farthest point of his survey, a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines where steam vents hissed intermittently from the ground. The temperature had dropped noticeably as clouds gathered overhead, casting the valley in a muted gray light that made colors seem less vibrant. Mitchell paused to check his instruments, noting that the barometric pressure was falling faster than the weather forecast had predicted. It was then that he first heard the sound, a low, melodic whistling that seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. The whistle was not like any bird call he recognized, nor did it match the whistling of wind through the trees. It maintained a consistent pitch for several seconds before modulating into a different note, creating a simple yet haunting melody that seemed to follow no natural pattern. Mitchell scanned the surrounding forest, his trained eyes searching for movement while his hand instinctively went to the bear spray holstered on his belt. The whistling continued for approximately 3 minutes before abruptly ceasing, leaving only the normal sounds of the valley, the distant rush of the Lamar River, the occasional bird call, and the whisper of wind through the grasses. Mitchell radioed his position to dispatch at 2:17 p.m., mentioning the unusual sound but requesting no assistance. The log entry would later note that his transmission contained unexplained background harmonics that the dispatcher initially attributed to atmospheric conditions. What followed next would challenge Mitchell's scientific understanding of the natural world and leave him with questions that persist to this day. As he began packing his equipment to head back toward the trailhead, he noticed footprints in the soft soil near the steam vents, prints that appeared human in shape but with an impossibly long stride length, suggesting a being over 7 feet tall. The prints led away from his position and disappeared at the edge of the clearing, with no corresponding prints indicating where the entity had come from. The soil between the prints was undisturbed, as if the being had simply materialized at the first print and dematerialized at the last. Mitchell photographed the prints with his department-issued camera, careful to include a ruler for scale, before continuing his observations. The whistling began again at approximately 2:45 p.m., this time closer to his position, and with increased complexity, what had been a simple melody now evolved into harmonies that seemed to mimic the patterns of human speech without forming recognizable words. Mitchell later described it as listening to a conversation in a language I almost understood but couldn't quite grasp. The sound seemed to move around him in a pattern that defied natural explanation, sometimes appearing to come from a fixed point, other times seeming to emanate from multiple locations simultaneously. At 3:02 p.m., Mitchell's compass needle began spinning erratically, a phenomenon he had never witnessed despite his extensive experience in geologically active areas. His GPS device simultaneously displayed conflicting coordinates, showing him both at his current location and nearly a mile away. The whistling grew louder as these equipment malfunctions intensified, creating what Mitchell described as a sense of pressure in the air, like before a thunderstorm, but without the accompanying weather patterns. He decided to retreat from the area, following his original path back toward the trailhead. As he moved away from the clearing, the whistling gradually diminished, and his equipment returned to normal functioning. By the time he reached the designated boundary of the Forbidden Zone at 3:47 p.m., all phenomena had ceased. The official investigation into Mitchell's report concluded that he had likely experienced a combination of unusual geological activity and auditory hallucinations caused by exposure to volcanic gases. However, this explanation fails to account for the physical evidence of the footprints, which were photographed and measured before being destroyed by rainfall 2 days later. Mitchell never returned to that section of the Lamar Valley, requesting a transfer to the less isolated Yellowstone Lake area the following season. In his official statement, he wrote, "I cannot explain what I experienced that afternoon, but I am certain of what I saw and heard. Something exists in those restricted areas that does not fit our understanding of the natural world, and I am not comfortable with the possibility of encountering it again." The photographs of the footprints remain in the Yellowstone archives, marked as unexplained geological phenomenon, despite their clear resemblance to footprints rather than any natural formation. Mitchell's encounter represents the first of several documented incidents in which park rangers reported auditory phenomena of an unknown origin in the Forbidden Zones, often accompanied by equipment malfunctions and physical evidence that defies conventional explanation. No trace of the entity responsible for the prints was ever found. Hundreds of miles away, in the southwestern section of the park, another ranger was about to discover that some encounters leave no physical evidence, only an indelible mark on the psyche. It was early June of 2007 when Ranger Sarah Chen began her seasonal assignment in the Beckler region, an area known for its waterfalls and relatively few visitors compared to other parts of Yellowstone. Chen had worked in several national parks before coming to Yellowstone, bringing with her a degree in environmental science and a deep respect for wilderness areas. Her duties involved maintaining the remote trail system and monitoring wildlife populations in what locals called the Cascade Corner, a region where multiple waterfalls created a constant background of rushing water. The Forbidden Zone here was defined by a series of thermal features that made off-trail travel extremely dangerous, with thin crusts covering scalding water just beneath the surface. On June 17th, Chen was conducting a solo survey of the Beckler River Trail, checking for erosion damage after the spring snowmelt. The day was overcast but dry, with temperatures in the mid-50s, typical for that elevation in early summer. She had covered approximately 3 miles of trail when she decided to take a break near a bend in the river where a small waterfall created a misty microclimate. As she sat on a fallen log eating her lunch, she noticed something unusual across the river, what appeared to be a tall, dark figure standing motionless among the trees. At first, Chen assumed it was a black bear, which were common in the area. However, as she continued to observe through her binoculars, she realized the figure was too tall and slender to be a bear, standing at least 7 feet high with an unnaturally still posture. The figure was completely black, absorbing rather than reflecting light, making it difficult to discern any features despite the relatively bright conditions. Chen watched for approximately 10 minutes, noting that the figure did not move at all, not even the slight swaying that a person or animal would normally exhibit while standing. The rushing water of the river and waterfall created a constant ambient sound, yet Chen felt an unnatural silence emanating from the figure's position, as if it were somehow absorbing sound as well as light. At 12:43 p.m., Chen radioed dispatch to report her location and the unusual sighting. The transmission was clear with no interference, and the dispatcher logged the call without noting any unusual background sounds. Chen described the figure as a tall, dark humanoid shape that doesn't seem to be affected by the wind or water mist. Following protocol, she remained in position to continue observation rather than approaching the figure. For the next 20 minutes, nothing changed. The figure remained perfectly still, facing her direction from across the river. Chen attempted to take photographs with her department-issued camera, but the images showed only a dark blur that could have been a shadow or equipment malfunction. She later described the experience as increasingly unsettling, writing in her report, "The longer I watched, the more I felt that I was being observed rather than observing. There was an intelligence behind that stillness that felt ancient and entirely other." At approximately 1:05 p.m., Chen experienced what she would later describe as a moment of disorientation, suddenly finding herself standing and facing away from the river, with no memory of having gotten up from the log. Her watch indicated that only a minute had passed, yet she felt as if significant time had elapsed. When she turned back to look across the river, the figure was gone. Chen immediately conducted a visual search of the area, noting that there were no paths or game trails in the vicinity where the figure had stood. The terrain was dense with undergrowth that would have made silent movement nearly impossible, especially for a creature of that size. She radioed dispatch again at 1:09 p.m. to report that the figure had disappeared, requesting that her supervisor be notified of the unusual sighting. When Chen's supervisor arrived at her location approximately 90 minutes later, they found no evidence of any unusual presence. The ground where the figure had stood showed no footprints or disturbed vegetation, despite the moist soil that should have retained impressions. The official investigation concluded that Chen had likely observed a shadow illusion created by the specific lighting conditions and the waterfall mist. However, this explanation does not account for the period of missing time or the profound sense of being observed that Chen experienced. In the weeks following the incident, Chen requested reassignment to a different section of the park, citing uncomfortable working conditions in the Beckler region. Her supervisor noted in her performance review that she seemed unusually vigilant and easily startled by sudden movements after the incident. Chen never returned to the Cascade Corner, leaving Yellowstone at the end of that season for a position in a less isolated park. Her official report remains in the Yellowstone archives, marked as unexplained visual phenomenon, despite the detailed nature of her observations. What makes Chen's encounter particularly significant is the psychological impact it had on an experienced ranger who had previously shown no tendency toward anxiety or superstition. Her supervisor later commented, "Sarah was one of our most level-headed rangers, always practical and by the book. Whatever she saw that day genuinely disturbed her in a way I've never seen before." The silent watcher, as the phenomenon came to be known among park staff, represents a type of encounter that leaves no physical evidence but creates an indelible impression on those who experience it. Several similar reports would be filed over the next decade, all describing tall, dark figures that appear and disappear without explanation, often accompanied by periods of missing time or unexplained disorientation. Chen's encounter serves as a reminder that not all mysteries in the forbidden zones leave physical traces. Some exist only in the memories of those who witness them, creating questions that can never be fully answered through conventional investigation. No evidence of the figure was ever found beyond Chen's detailed testimony. It was early August of 2011 when the seasonal ranger station at Cache Creek went silent for 48 hours, an incident that would later be documented in Yellowstone Internal Report 11C893. The station, located in a remote section of the park's northeast corner, was manned by two rangers, Michael Torres and Emma Wilkinson, both experienced in wilderness survival and radio protocol. Their assignment involved monitoring wildlife movement patterns in a region that had recently experienced increased grizzly bear activity. The Forbidden Zone designation for this area stemmed from geological instability rather than unusual phenomena, with frequent micro-earthquakes and unpredictable ground temperatures making it unsuitable for public access. Torres and Wilkinson had checked in with dispatch at 6 p.m. on August 3rd, reporting normal conditions and noting their intention to conduct an evening patrol along the Cache Creek drainage. Their next scheduled check-in was at 10 p.m., but when dispatch attempted to contact them at that time, they received no response. Standard procedure called for repeated attempts at 15-minute intervals, but after an hour of failed contact, dispatch notified the on-duty supervisor. At 11:30 p.m., a search team was assembled at the nearest ranger station, approximately 12 miles away. The team consisted of 3 rangers with experience in the Cache Creek terrain, along with a park medic. They reached the Miller station at 2:15 a.m. on August 4th, finding the building in perfect order with no signs of forced entry or struggle. Both rangers' gear was present, including their sidearms and emergency equipment. The station log showed the entry at 6 p.m., but nothing after that time. A half-empty pot of coffee sat on the stove, still warm to the touch, and 2 partially eaten meals were on the table, suggesting the rangers had been interrupted while eating. The search team immediately established a perimeter and began methodical searching of the surrounding area, using night vision equipment and following standard lost person procedures. At 3:47 a.m., one of the searchers discovered Wilkinson's radio lying on the ground approximately 200 yards from the station, still powered on, but with the antenna detached. The battery indicator showed nearly full power, suggesting the radio had not been abandoned long. The search team radioed this discovery to dispatch, noting that the terrain around the radio showed no signs of struggle, no footprints other than those belonging to the searchers, no disturbed vegetation, and no drag marks. As dawn broke on August 4th, additional search teams arrived, expanding the search area to cover a 5-mile radius around the station. By mid-morning, they had discovered Torres's hat approximately a quarter-mile from where Wilkinson's radio was found. Like the radio, it was lying in an area with no surrounding tracks or signs of passage. The search continued throughout August 4th without further discoveries, despite the deployment of additional resources, including a helicopter with thermal imaging capabilities. As darkness fell on the second day of searching, the incident took an unexpected turn. At 9:37 p.m., the Miller station's radio suddenly came to life, transmitting a single word that was logged by multiple dispatchers: inside. The voice was identified as Torres, but the transmission quality was unusually clear despite the distance and terrain. When dispatch attempted to respond, there was only static. The radio remained silent for the next hour before transmitting another single word at 10:42 p.m. Running. Again, the voice was identified as Torres, with Wilkinson heard briefly in the background saying something that was logged as "don't look." The transmissions continued at irregular intervals throughout the night, always single words or short phrases that provided little context but conveyed increasing urgency. At 2:19 a.m., Wilkinson's voice transmitted the word "circle," followed by Torres saying "not natural" 2 minutes later. The final transmission came at 3:52 a.m., when both voices could be heard saying "help" simultaneously before the radio went permanently silent. Search teams immediately converged on the station, finding no new evidence or signs of the missing rangers. The radio showed no indication of recent use, with no fingerprints other than those belonging to the search team members who had examined it earlier. The incident would remain unexplained until August 6th, when Torres and Wilkinson stumbled out of the forest approximately 7 miles from their station, severely dehydrated and disoriented, but otherwise unharmed. Their clothing was torn and covered in mud, but they showed no signs of injury or animal attack. Medical examination revealed no significant health issues beyond dehydration and exhaustion. The Rangers' initial statements were fragmented and contradictory, but over the following days, they were able to provide a more coherent account of their 48-hour disappearance. According to their testimony, they had left the station at approximately 7:30 p.m. on August 3rd to investigate unusual lights they had observed in the northern sky. As they moved away from the station, they became disoriented by what they described as a silence that pressed in from all directions, a complete absence of normal nighttime sounds, including insects, wind, and distant animal calls. The Rangers reported that their flashlights began malfunctioning, flickering and dimming despite new batteries. They attempted to return to the station but found that the landscape appeared to have changed, with familiar landmarks missing or in different positions. Torres stated, "It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while we weren't looking. The trail we had followed was gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain that seemed to shift as we watched." Wilkinson described seeing tall, thin figures moving between the trees at impossible speeds, though she acknowledged that exhaustion and fear might have affected her perception. The Rangers wandered through what they described as an increasingly surreal landscape, eventually taking shelter in a small cave where they remained until dawn. Throughout the night, they reported hearing what sounded like whispering in an unknown language just beyond the cave entrance, though they could see nothing when they looked. The following day, they attempted to navigate back to familiar territory, but found themselves moving in circles despite their compass and GPS devices. They reported that time seemed to move erratically, with periods that felt like hours passing in what their watches showed as minutes, and vice versa. On the night of August 5th, they found their way back to an area they recognized from previous patrols, eventually reaching a main trail where they were discovered by a search team the following morning. The official investigation concluded that the Rangers had likely experienced a combination of disorientation, panic, and hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. However, this explanation fails to account for the radio transmissions, which were recorded by multiple dispatchers and verified by technical analysis. The transmissions showed no signs of tampering or external manipulation, and voice analysis confirmed that the speakers were indeed Torres and Wilkinson. Both Rangers underwent psychological evaluation following the incident, with both being cleared for duty after a period of leave. However, neither requested another assignment in the Cache Creek region, with both transferring to different parks at the end of the season. Their official report remains one of the most detailed accounts of ranger disappearance in Yellowstone history, documenting a 48-hour period during which 2 experienced wilderness professionals became completely disoriented in familiar terrain despite having functional navigation equipment. The incident at Miller Station represents a type of encounter that combines elements of disappearance, equipment malfunction, and auditory phenomena, creating a comprehensive mystery that defies conventional explanation. No evidence was ever found to explain the Rangers' experience beyond their own testimony. It was mid-October of 2015 when park geologist Dr. Rebecca Harding first documented what would become known as the thermal anomaly of Norris Geyser Basin. Harding had been with the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory for 7 years, specializing in monitoring the park's geothermal systems for signs of instability. Her work involved regular visits to remote thermal areas to collect data and install monitoring equipment. The forbidden zone in question was a section of the Norris Geyser Basin that had been closed to the public since 2003, following a series of unusual temperature spikes and ground deformation events. Harding entered the restricted area on October 16th, accompanied by 2 technicians, their mission being to replace damaged sensors in a series of thermal vents that had been showing erratic readings for several weeks. The morning was cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a light steam rising from the numerous thermal features throughout the basin. The team followed a marked path that had been established for authorized personnel, taking precautions to avoid areas where the ground might be unstable. By 10:30 a.m., they had reached the first sensor location, a vent known as cauldron due to its consistently boiling water and distinctive mineral deposits. As Harding began removing the old sensor, she noticed that the water temperature was significantly higher than the readings indicated, approximately 205 degrees Celsius, rather than the expected 198 degrees Celsius. She noted this discrepancy in her field log, intending to investigate further after completing the replacements. The team worked their way through the basin, replacing sensors at 3 additional locations before stopping for lunch at 12:45 p.m. It was during this break that Harding first observed what would later become the central focus of her report, a peculiar thermal pattern that seemed to move against the natural flow of the underground water system. Using a thermal imaging camera, she documented what appeared to be a cold spot, approximately 6 feet in diameter, that was maintaining a temperature of 78 degrees, while surrounded by water and steam exceeding 180 degrees. What made this particularly unusual was that the cold spot appeared to be moving slowly in a path that did not correspond to any known underground channels or surface features. Harding and her technicians observed the phenomenon for approximately 20 minutes, documenting its movement with both the thermal camera and regular photography. The cold spot traveled in a roughly circular pattern around a series of smaller vents, maintaining its consistent temperature and size despite the extreme temperature differential with its surroundings. At 1:15 p.m., Harding radioed the observatory to report the anomaly, requesting permission to remain in the area for additional observation. The transmission was logged as clear with no interference, and Harding's supervisor approved the extended observation period. For the next 2 hours, the team continued to document the cold spot's movement, noting that it occasionally paused near specific vents before resuming its circular path. At approximately 3:20 p.m., the phenomenon took an unexpected turn when the cold spot suddenly expanded to cover an area of approximately 15 feet in diameter. The temperature within this larger area remained consistent at 78 degrees, creating a stark contrast with the surrounding thermal features. Harding later described the experience as like watching a bubble of cold water move through a boiling pot, defying all laws of thermodynamics. The team remained in position, documenting the expansion and subsequent movement of the enlarged cold spot. At 3:47 p.m., one of the technicians noticed what appeared to be footprints forming within the cold spot area, impressions in the mineral crust that appeared as if an invisible weight was being applied to the surface. Harding immediately focused the thermal camera on these impressions, discovering that they maintained the same 78-degree temperature as the rest of the cold spot area. The footprints appeared in a sequence that suggested a walking motion, though no visible entity was creating them. Harding documented this development with both video and still photography, noting that the footprints appeared to be approximately 12 inches in length with a narrow width that did not correspond to any known animal or human shoe print. The phenomenon continued for approximately 15 minutes before the cold spot began to shrink, returning to its original 6-foot diameter. The footprints ceased appearing as the cold spot contracted, leaving no trace on the mineral crust. The team continued to observe the phenomenon until 4:30 p.m., when it gradually dissipated, with the thermal patterns returning to their expected configurations. Harding and her technicians collected additional data before departing the restricted area at 5:00 p.m. The official investigation into Harding's report included analysis of the photographic evidence, thermal data, and mineral samples collected from the area where the cold spot had been observed. The investigation concluded that the team had likely witnessed an unusual but natural combination of thermal dynamics and atmospheric conditions that created temporary temperature differentials. However, this explanation does not account for the footprint impressions that appeared within the cold spot area, which were clearly documented in both thermal and visual recordings. Harding submitted a detailed report to the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, including all data and observations from the incident. The report was classified as unusual thermal phenomenon and filed in the restricted archives, accessible only to authorized personnel. In the weeks following the incident, Harding requested additional monitoring equipment for the Norris Geyser Basin, specifically thermal cameras with higher resolution and continuous recording capabilities. Her request was approved, and the enhanced monitoring system was installed in November of 2015. The system has since documented numerous unusual thermal patterns, though none as extreme or prolonged as the phenomenon observed on October 16th. Harding continued her work at Yellowstone for 2 more years before accepting a position at the United States Geological Survey, where she specialized in volcanic systems worldwide. In a private correspondence with a former colleague in 2018, she wrote, "I've studied thermal systems on 5 continents, and I've never seen anything like what we witnessed that day in Norris. There are forces at work in Yellowstone that we don't yet understand, phenomena that operate according to principles we have yet to discover. The thermal anomaly of Norris Geyser Basin represents a type of encounter that combines scientific observation with inexplicable phenomena, creating a mystery that exists at the intersection of documented natural processes and events that defy conventional explanation." Harding's meticulous documentation of the incident provides some of the most compelling evidence of unusual phenomena in Yellowstone's forbidden zones, recorded using scientific instruments and analyzed by trained professionals. No explanation has ever been provided for the footprint impressions that appeared within the cold spot, nor for the apparent intelligence suggested by the phenomenon's movement patterns. It was late July of 2018 when Ranger James Callahan first recorded what would become known as the Whispering Rocks phenomenon in the remote backcountry of Yellowstone's Specimen Ridge area. Callahan had been with the Park Service for 5 years, spending his summers conducting wildlife surveys in the park's most isolated regions. His assignment that week involved monitoring the reintroduced wolf pack in the Lamar Valley, requiring overnight stays in a small cabin approximately 15 miles from the nearest road. The Forbidden Zone designation for this area stemmed from its remote location and the presence of unstable fossil beds that could collapse without warning. Callahan had set up his monitoring equipment on July 22nd, establishing a base of operations at the cabin before heading out to place remote cameras along the ridge. The day was hot and dry, with a haze from distant wildfires partially obscuring the sky. By late afternoon, thunderheads had begun to form, creating the typical afternoon weather pattern for that time of year. Callahan returned to the cabin at approximately 6 p.m., intending to review his data before heading out again at dusk. As he entered the cabin, he noticed what sounded like whispering coming from outside, faint, indistinct voices that seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. At first, Callahan assumed the sound was created by wind moving through the unusual rock formations that gave Specimen Ridge its name. However, as he listened more closely, he realized the whispering had a rhythmic quality that suggested human speech rather than natural sounds. Using a parabolic microphone connected to a digital recorder, Callahan attempted to capture the phenomenon, noting that the whispering seemed to intensify as he began recording. The audio file, which would later be analyzed by specialists, contained what appeared to be multiple voices speaking in an unknown language, with a cadence and structure that suggested intentional communication rather than random sound patterns. Callahan radioed dispatch at 7:15 p.m. to report the unusual audio phenomenon, requesting that the transmission be monitored for interference. The dispatcher logged the call as clear with no background sounds other than Callahan's voice, suggesting that the whispering was not being transmitted through the radio system. For the next hour, Callahan continued to document the phenomenon, recording multiple audio files and taking notes on the perceived direction and intensity of the sounds. The whispering seemed to move around the cabin in a pattern that suggested multiple sources rather than a single point of origin. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Callahan decided to investigate the source of the sounds, taking his recording equipment and flashlight to search the immediate area around the cabin. The whispering seemed to recede as he moved away from the building, only to return when he stopped moving. This pattern suggested that the phenomenon was somehow connected to his presence or observation, a detail that Callahan found particularly unsettling. As dusk approached, the whispering began to change in character, with individual voices becoming more distinct while remaining incomprehensible. Callahan later described the experience as like listening to a conversation in a language I almost understood but couldn't quite grasp, with words that seemed familiar yet remained just beyond recognition. At 9:45 p.m., Callahan observed what appeared to be small lights moving between the rock formations near the cabin. The lights were approximately the size and brightness of fireflies but moved in patterns that suggested intentional rather than random movement. Using night vision binoculars, Callahan attempted to identify the source of the lights, finding only that they appeared to be spherical and self-illuminated rather than reflections or bioluminescence. The lights moved in coordinated patterns, sometimes forming geometric shapes before dispersing and reforming in different configurations. Callahan documented this phenomenon with both video and still photography, though the images showed only points of light without clear definition or structure. The whispering continued throughout the night, varying in intensity and complexity, but never ceasing entirely. Callahan attempted to sleep but found the sounds increasingly disruptive, describing them as intrusive thoughts that weren't my own. At 3:17 a.m., he experienced what he would later describe as a moment of overwhelming clarity, during which he felt compelled to go outside despite the darkness and cold. As he stepped out of the cabin, he observed what appeared to be a tall, slender figure standing approximately 50 yards away, silhouetted against the rock formations. The figure remained motionless for approximately 30 seconds before moving away with a speed that Callahan described as impossibly fast and silent. When dawn broke on July 23rd, the whispering gradually diminished, ceasing entirely by 6:30 a.m. Callahan conducted a thorough search of the area around the cabin, finding no footprints or other physical evidence to explain the previous night's phenomena. The rock formations showed no signs of disturbance, and the ground was undisturbed except for Callahan's own tracks. Callahan radioed dispatch at 7 a.m. to report his experiences, requesting that his supervisor be notified and that a technical team be sent to analyze his audio recordings. The supervisor arrived at the cabin at approximately 11 a.m., accompanied by a sound specialist from the park's research division. The audio files were analyzed on site, with the specialist confirming that they contained what appeared to be multiple voices speaking in an unknown language. The recordings showed no signs of tampering or external manipulation, and frequency analysis suggested that the sounds were not produced by any known natural phenomena. The official investigation into Callahan's report concluded that he had likely experienced a combination of auditory hallucination and misinterpretation of natural sounds. However, this explanation does not account for the audio recordings, which were analyzed by multiple specialists and verified as containing unexplained vocal patterns. Callahan's report was filed as Unexplained Auditory Phenomenon and placed in the restricted archives accessible only to authorized personnel. In the weeks following the incident, Callahan requested reassignment to a different section of the park, citing uncomfortable working conditions in the Specimen Ridge area. His supervisor noted in his performance review that he seemed unusually vigilant and easily startled by unexpected sounds after the incident. Callahan never returned to the Specimen Ridge cabin, leaving Yellowstone at the end of that season for a position in a less isolated park. The Whispering Rocks phenomenon represents a type of encounter that combines auditory phenomena with visual elements, creating a comprehensive mystery that affects multiple senses simultaneously. Callahan's detailed documentation and the audio recordings provide some of the most compelling evidence of unusual phenomena in Yellowstone's forbidden zones, recorded using professional equipment and analyzed by trained specialists. No explanation has ever been provided for the voices captured on the recordings, nor for the lights that Callahan observed moving among the rock formations. The cabin where the incident occurred remains in use, though several rangers have requested reassignment after experiencing similar phenomena during overnight stays. It was early September of 2020 when Ranger Marcus Williams first documented what would become known as the shadow phenomenon at Obsidian Cliff, a remote area of Yellowstone known for its volcanic glass formations and relative isolation from main tourist routes. Williams had been with the National Park Service for 8 years, specializing in geological formations and their impact on local ecosystems. His assignment that week involved conducting a detailed survey of the obsidian deposits in the area, part of a long-term study on erosion patterns in volcanic glass. The Forbidden Zone designation for this region stemmed from the unstable nature of the obsidian cliffs, which could shed sharp fragments without warning, making the area dangerous for untrained visitors. Williams began his survey on September 3rd, establishing a base camp at the edge of the restricted area before moving deeper into the territory to take measurements and collect samples. The weather was clear and mild, with temperatures in the mid-60s and a light breeze from the west. By mid-afternoon, Williams had reached the primary obsidian formation, a sheer cliff face approximately 80 feet high that glittered in the sunlight like black glass. As he began taking measurements, Williams noticed something unusual about the shadows cast by the cliff. They appeared to move independently of the sun's position, creating patterns that defied the natural laws of light and shadow. At first, Williams attributed this to optical illusions created by the reflective properties of the obsidian, but as he continued to observe, he realized the movements were too complex and coordinated to be explained by simple reflection. Using his department-issued camera, Williams began documenting the phenomenon, taking photographs at regular intervals to track the shadow movements. The images showed what appeared to be shadowy figures moving along the cliff face, sometimes appearing to climb vertically or move horizontally in ways that defied gravity. Williams later described the experience as watching shadows that had a life of their own, moving with purpose and intelligence rather than simply following the sun. At 3:45 p.m., Williams radioed dispatch to report his location and the unusual phenomenon he was observing. The transmission was logged as clear with no interference, and the dispatcher noted that Williams sounded calm but intrigued by what he was witnessing. Williams continued to document the shadow movements for the next hour, noting that they seemed to respond to his presence, becoming more active when he observed them directly and diminishing when he looked away. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the phenomenon took an unexpected turn when one of the shadowy figures detached from the cliff face and moved across the open ground toward Williams's position. The figure maintained its shadow-like appearance even as it moved away from the cliff, creating what Williams described as a three-dimensional shadow that existed without an object to cast it. Williams remained in position, continuing to document the phenomenon as the figure approached to within approximately 20 feet of his location. The figure was approximately 6 feet tall and humanoid in shape, though with proportions that were subtly wrong: arms that seemed slightly too long and a head that appeared too small for its body. The figure remained motionless for approximately 5 minutes before turning and moving back toward the cliff face, where it merged with the other shadows and disappeared. Williams continued his observations until dusk, documenting additional shadow movements, but no further detachments from the cliff face. As darkness fell, he returned to his base camp, reviewing the photographs and video recordings he had made throughout the afternoon. The images clearly showed the shadow figures and their unusual movements, though the quality was somewhat diminished by the reflective properties of the obsidian and the bright sunlight. The following morning, Williams returned to the cliff face to continue his survey, finding no physical evidence of the previous day's phenomena, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, and no unusual markings on the obsidian surface. He conducted a thorough search of the area, using a magnetometer to check for any metallic deposits that might explain the shadow movements, but found nothing unusual. Williams radioed dispatch at 9:00 a.m. to report his continued observations, requesting that a geological specialist be sent to examine the cliff face. The specialist arrived at approximately 2:00 p.m., accompanied by a photographer with specialized equipment designed to minimize glare and reflection. Together, they documented the cliff face and surrounding area, though the shadow phenomenon did not recur during their visit. The specialist collected several samples of obsidian for analysis, noting that the geological composition was consistent with other formations in the area. The official investigation into Williams's report included analysis of the photographs and video recordings, as well as geological examination of the obsidian cliff. The investigation concluded that Williams had likely witnessed an unusual combination of lighting conditions and optical illusions created by the reflective properties of the obsidian. However, this explanation does not account for the detached shadow figure that moved independently of the cliff face, which was clearly documented in Williams's photographs and video recordings. Williams submitted a detailed report to the park's geological division, including all data and observations from the incident. The report was classified as unusual optical phenomenon and filed in the restricted archives accessible only to authorized personnel. In the weeks following the incident, Williams requested additional monitoring equipment for the Obsidian Cliff area, specifically high-resolution cameras capable of capturing images in multiple light spectrums. His request was approved, and the enhanced monitoring system was installed in October of 2020. The system has since documented numerous unusual shadow patterns, though none as extreme or prolonged as the phenomenon observed on September 3rd. Williams continued his work at Yellowstone for another year before accepting a position with the United States Geological Survey, where he specialized in volcanic glass formations worldwide. In a presentation at a geological conference in 2022, he made reference to unusual light and shadow phenomena observed in volcanic glass formations, though he did not specifically mention his experience at Obsidian Cliff. The shadow phenomenon at Obsidian Cliff represents a type of encounter that combines visual phenomena with elements that appear to defy the laws of physics, creating a mystery that exists at the intersection of optical science and unexplained natural phenomena. Williams's meticulous documentation of the incident provides some of the most compelling visual evidence of unusual phenomena in Yellowstone's forbidden zones, recorded using professional equipment and analyzed by trained specialists. No explanation has ever been provided for the detached shadow figure that moved independently of the cliff face, nor for the apparent intelligence suggested by the coordinated movements of the shadow figures. The monitoring system installed after the incident continues to document unusual shadow patterns, though none as extreme as those initially observed by Williams. It was late May of 2014 when seasonal ranger Benjamin Thompson disappeared during a solo patrol in the remote Pelican Valley area of Yellowstone, an incident that would later be documented in Yellowstone Incident Report 14D-521. Thompson had been with the National Park Service for 3 seasons, all spent in Yellowstone's backcountry division. His assignment that week involved monitoring the grizzly bear population in a region that had recently seen increased bear activity near hiking trails. The forbidden zone in question was a section of the Pelican Valley known for its dense vegetation and unpredictable water levels, making navigation challenging even for experienced rangers. Thompson began his patrol on May 28th, checking in with dispatch at 7 a.m. before heading into the restricted area. His planned route covered approximately 10 miles of rugged terrain, including several river crossings and steep ascents through heavily forested areas. The weather was clear but cool, with temperatures in the low 50s and a light breeze from the northwest. Thompson's last scheduled check-in was at 12 p.m., when he reported his position near the Pelican Creek drainage and noted that he had observed fresh grizzly tracks in the area. He indicated that he would be continuing his patrol as planned, with his next check-in scheduled for 4:00 p.m. When dispatch attempted to contact Thompson at 4:00 p.m., they received no response. Standard procedure called for repeated attempts at 15-minute intervals, but after an hour of failed contact, dispatch notified the on-duty supervisor. At 5:30 p.m., a search team was assembled at the nearest ranger station, approximately 8 miles from Thompson's last known position. The team consisted of 4 rangers with experience in the Pelican Valley terrain, along with a park medic and 2 search and rescue dogs. The search was hampered by approaching darkness and deteriorating weather conditions, with rain beginning to fall at approximately 7 p.m. The search team reached Thompson's last known position at 8:45 p.m., finding no signs of the missing ranger or any indication of struggle. The area showed normal wildlife activity and no evidence of bear attack or other natural hazards. The team established a base camp and continued searching throughout the night, using night vision equipment and following standard lost person procedures. As dawn broke on May 29th, additional search teams arrived, expanding the search area to cover a 10-mile radius around Thompson's last known position. By mid-morning, they had discovered Thompson's backpack lying beside a small creek approximately 2 miles from his last reported position. The pack was undamaged and contained all of Thompson's standard equipment, including his sidearm, radio, and emergency supplies. The pack was dry despite the rain that had fallen throughout the night, suggesting it had been placed there after the precipitation had ceased. A search of the surrounding area revealed no footprints other than those belonging to the search teams, and no signs of Thompson's passage beyond the location where his pack was found. The search continued throughout May 29th without additional discoveries, despite the deployment of extra resources, including a helicopter with thermal imaging capabilities. As darkness fell on the second day of searching, the incident took an unexpected turn. At 9:17 p.m., Thompson's radio suddenly transmitted a single phrase that was logged by multiple dispatchers. "They're watching from the trees." The voice was identified as Thompson, but the transmission quality was unusually clear despite the distance and terrain. When dispatch attempted to respond, there was only static. The radio remained silent for the next hour before transmitting another short phrase at 10:23 p.m. "Not human." Again, the voice was identified as Thompson, though the transmission had a strange quality that dispatchers later described as sounding as if he were speaking in a whisper from a great distance. The transmissions continued at irregular intervals throughout the night, always short phrases that conveyed increasing urgency and confusion. At 2:45 a.m., Thompson's voice transmitted the words "circle of stones," followed by "don't come" 2 minutes later. The final transmission came at 3:52 a.m. when Thompson's voice said, "They're all around me," before the radio went permanently silent. Search teams immediately converged on the area where the pack had been found, but discovered no new evidence or signs of Thompson. The radio showed no indication of recent use, with no fingerprints other than those belonging to the search team members who had examined it earlier. The incident would remain unexplained until June 2nd, when Thompson stumbled out of the forest approximately 12 miles from where his pack had been found, severely dehydrated and disoriented but otherwise unharmed. His clothing was torn and covered in mud, and he was missing one boot, but he showed no signs of injury or animal attack. Medical examination revealed no significant health issues beyond dehydration, exhaustion, and numerous small scratches consistent with moving through dense vegetation. Thompson's initial statements were fragmented and contradictory, but over the following days, he was able to provide a more coherent account of his 5-day disappearance. According to his testimony, he had been following a series of grizzly tracks when he observed what appeared to be a group of figures moving through the forest approximately 200 yards from his position. The figures were tall and slender, moving with a speed that seemed impossible in the dense undergrowth. Thompson decided to investigate, leaving the established trail and moving toward the figure's last known position. As he moved deeper into the forest, he became disoriented by what he described as a silence that pressed in from all directions, a complete absence of normal forest sounds, including birds, insects, and small animal movements. Thompson reported that his compass began spinning erratically, and his GPS device displayed conflicting coordinates. He attempted to return to the trail but found that the landscape appeared to have changed, with familiar landmarks missing or in different positions. Thompson stated, "It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. The trees seemed to shift position, creating paths that hadn't existed before and closing ones I had just followed." As darkness fell, Thompson took shelter in a small hollow, covering himself with pine branches to stay warm. Throughout the night, he reported hearing what sounded like whispering in an unknown language just beyond his hiding place, though he could see nothing when he looked. The following day, Thompson attempted to navigate back to familiar territory, but found himself moving in circles despite his efforts to maintain a consistent direction. He reported seeing the tall figures periodically in the distance, always observing him from the tree line, but never approaching directly. On the second night of his disappearance, Thompson discovered what he described as a circle of stones, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with each stone standing upright rather than lying flat as would occur naturally. The circle appeared to be ancient, with lichen covering the surfaces of the stones, yet the ground within the circle was completely free of vegetation or debris. Thompson entered the circle, seeking shelter from the cold, and immediately experienced what he described as a sensation of movement without moving, as if the circle were rotating or traveling while remaining stationary. He remained within the stone circle throughout the night, reporting that the whispering sounds intensified but seemed to remain outside the circle's boundary. The following morning, Thompson left the circle and continued his attempts to find familiar landmarks, eventually discovering a small stream that he recognized from previous patrols. He followed the stream for 2 days before reaching a main trail where he was discovered by a search team. The official investigation into Thompson's disappearance concluded that he had likely experienced a combination of disorientation, panic, and hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. However, this explanation fails to account for the radio transmissions, which were recorded by multiple dispatchers and verified by technical analysis. The transmissions showed no signs of tampering or external manipulation, and voice analysis confirmed that the speaker was indeed Thompson. Thompson underwent psychological evaluation following the incident, with both being cleared for duty after a period of leave. However, he requested reassignment to a different section of the park, specifically asking to avoid the Pelican Valley area. Thompson's official report remains one of the most detailed accounts of ranger disappearance in Yellowstone history, documenting a 5-day period during which an experienced wilderness professional became completely disoriented in familiar terrain despite having functional navigation equipment. The disappearance of Ranger Thompson represents a type of encounter that combines elements of disappearance, equipment malfunction, auditory phenomena, and mysterious structures, creating a comprehensive mystery that defies conventional explanation. No evidence was ever found to explain Thompson's experience beyond his own testimony, nor was the stone circle he described ever located despite extensive searching of the area. It was early June of 2019 when Ranger Elena Rodriguez first documented what would become known as the Voices of Firehole River phenomenon in the remote backcountry of Yellowstone's Firehole Canyon area. Rodriguez had been with the Park Service for 6 years, spending her summers conducting water quality surveys in the park's various river systems. Her assignment that week involved testing thermal pollution levels in the Firehole River, which is fed by numerous geothermal features throughout its course. The Forbidden Zone designation for this area stemmed from the extreme temperature variations in the river, which could change from cold to scalding in a matter of feet due to underwater thermal vents. Rodriguez began her survey on June 5th, establishing a series of monitoring stations along a 10-mile stretch of the river that was inaccessible to the public. The weather was warm and sunny, with temperatures in the upper 70s and a light breeze moving through the canyon. By early afternoon, Rodriguez had completed her first 3 monitoring stations and was preparing to move to the 4th location when she first noticed the unusual phenomenon. As she was packing her equipment, Rodriguez heard what sounded like voices coming from the river itself, faint, indistinct whispers that seemed to emanate from the water rather than the surrounding forest. At first, Rodriguez attributed the sound to water moving through unusual rock formations in the riverbed, a phenomenon she had encountered in other river systems. However, as she listened more closely, she realized the voices had a rhythmic quality that suggested human speech rather than natural sounds. Using a waterproof hydrophone connected to a digital recorder, Rodriguez attempted to capture the phenomenon, noting that the voices seemed to intensify as she began recording. The audio file, which would later be analyzed by acoustic specialists, contained what appeared to be multiple voices speaking in an unknown language with a cadence and structure that suggested intentional communication rather than random sound patterns. Rodriguez radioed dispatch at 2:30 p.m. to report the unusual audio phenomenon, requesting that the transmission be monitored for interference. The dispatcher logged the call as clear with no background sounds other than Rodriguez's voice, suggesting that the voices were not being transmitted through the radio system. For the next hour, Rodriguez continued to document the phenomenon, recording multiple audio files and taking notes on the perceived location and intensity of the sounds. The voices seemed to move along the river in a pattern that suggested they were being carried by the current, sometimes appearing to emanate from specific locations before fading and reappearing downstream. At approximately 3:45 p.m., Rodriguez decided to investigate the source of the sounds, taking her recording equipment and moving downstream along the riverbank. The voices seemed to maintain a consistent distance from her position, receding as she approached and intensifying when she stopped moving. This pattern suggested that the phenomenon was somehow connected to her presence or observation, a detail that Rodriguez found particularly intriguing. As the afternoon progressed, the voices began to change in character, with individual voices becoming more distinct while remaining incomprehensible. Rodriguez later described the experience as like listening to a conversation in a language I almost understood, but couldn't quite grasp, with words that seemed familiar yet remained just beyond recognition. At 5:20 p.m., Rodriguez observed what appeared to be small areas of the river glowing with a soft blue light, approximately 2 feet in diameter. The lights appeared and disappeared at irregular intervals, sometimes moving against the current before fading completely. Using a waterproof camera, Rodriguez attempted to photograph the phenomenon, though the images showed only areas of slightly lighter water without clear definition or structure. The lights appeared in coordination with the voices, sometimes brightening when the sounds intensified and dimming when they faded. Rodriguez documented this phenomenon with both video and still photography, though the quality was limited by the reflective properties of the water surface. The voices continued throughout the evening, varying in intensity and complexity, but never ceasing entirely. Rodriguez decided to remain in the area overnight, setting up a small camp on a bluff overlooking the river where she could continue her observations. As darkness fell, the voices became clearer and more distinct, though still incomprehensible. The blue lights in the water became more visible after sunset, creating an eerie display that Rodriguez described as like watching thoughts manifest as light and sound. At 11:45 p.m., Rodriguez experienced what she would later describe as a moment of overwhelming understanding, during which she felt as if she could almost comprehend the meaning of the voices. This sensation lasted for approximately 3 minutes before fading, leaving Rodriguez with a feeling of profound loss for something she had never truly possessed. The following morning, the voices gradually diminished, ceasing entirely by 7:30 a.m. The blue lights in the water disappeared around the same time, leaving the river looking normal in the morning light. Rodriguez conducted a thorough search of the area, finding no physical evidence to explain the previous day's phenomena. The river showed no signs of unusual mineral deposits or thermal activity that might explain the lights or sounds. Rodriguez radioed dispatch at 8:00 a.m. to report her experiences, requesting that a technical team be sent to analyze her audio recordings. The team arrived at approximately 1:00 p.m., accompanied by an acoustic specialist from the park's research division. The audio files were analyzed on site, with the specialist confirming that they contained what appeared to be multiple voices speaking in an unknown language. The recordings showed no signs of tampering or external manipulation, and frequency analysis suggested that the sounds were not produced by any known natural phenomena. Water samples collected from the areas where the lights had appeared showed no unusual chemical or mineral content, and thermal imaging revealed no temperature variations that might explain the phenomenon. The official investigation into Rodriguez's report concluded that she had likely experienced a combination of auditory hallucination and misinterpretation of natural sounds. However, This explanation does not account for the audio recordings, which were analyzed by multiple specialists and verified as containing unexplained vocal patterns. Rodriguez's report was filed as Unexplained Auditory and Visual Phenomenon and placed in the restricted archives accessible only to authorized personnel. In the weeks following the incident, Rodriguez requested additional monitoring equipment for the Firehole River area, specifically underwater hydrophones with continuous recording capabilities and low-light cameras designed to capture images in aquatic environments. Her request was approved, and the enhanced monitoring system was installed in July of 2019. The system has since documented numerous unusual audio patterns and occasional light phenomena, though none as extreme or prolonged as those observed on June 5th. Rodriguez continued her work at Yellowstone for 2 more years before accepting a position with the Environmental Protection Agency, where she specialized in water quality in river systems nationwide. In a research paper published in 2022, she made reference to unexplained acoustic phenomena observed in geothermal river systems, though she did not specifically mention her experience at Firehole River. The Voices of Firehole River phenomenon represents a type of encounter that combines auditory phenomena with visual elements, creating a comprehensive mystery that affects multiple senses simultaneously. Rodriguez's detailed documentation and the audio recordings provide some of the most compelling evidence of unusual phenomena in Yellowstone's forbidden zones, recorded using professional equipment and analyzed by trained specialists. No explanation has ever been provided for the voices captured on the recordings, nor for the blue lights that Rodriguez observed in the river. The monitoring system installed after the incident continues to document unusual acoustic patterns, though none as extreme as those initially observed by Rodriguez. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, with Yellowstone National Park serving as a powerful reminder that even our most studied and protected territories contain mysteries that defy conventional explanation. The 8 ranger encounters documented in this episode span nearly 2 decades, multiple seasons, and diverse geographical regions within the park. Yet they share common threads that suggest something beyond our current understanding of the natural world. These witnesses are not casual observers or thrill seekers, but trained professionals, men and women who have dedicated their lives to understanding and preserving wilderness areas. Their expertise in natural phenomena makes their testimony particularly compelling, as they are precisely the people most likely to identify rational explanations for unusual occurrences. Yet even they could not explain what they experienced in Yellowstone's forbidden zones. The phenomena they described range from auditory experiences like the whispering rocks and the voices of Firehole River to visual manifestations such as the shadow of Obsidian Cliff and the thermal anomaly of Norris Geyser Basin. Some encounters involved physical evidence, like the footprints documented by Ranger Mitchell, while others left only psychological impressions, as experienced by Ranger Chen. The most disturbing accounts involve periods of missing time and disorientation, as reported by Rangers Torres, Wilkinson, and Thompson, experienced wilderness professionals who became lost in familiar terrain despite having functional navigation equipment. What makes these encounters particularly significant is their consistency across different witnesses, locations, and time periods. The tall, dark figures described by multiple rangers, the equipment malfunctions that occurred during unusual phenomena, and the feelings of being watched by an unseen intelligence all suggest patterns that transcend individual experience. These patterns persist despite official explanations that typically attribute such encounters to hallucination, misinterpretation of natural phenomena, or psychological stress. While such explanations may account for some aspects of the experiences, they fail to address the physical evidence, the audio recordings, and the detailed observations made by multiple trained professionals. The forbidden zones of Yellowstone remain restricted for officially stated reasons related to geological instability, dangerous wildlife, or environmental preservation. Yet one wonders if these designations also serve to limit public exposure to phenomena that park administrators cannot explain or control. The silence that follows these encounters, the absence of answers, The reluctance to discuss such experiences openly creates a vacuum that fills with speculation and fear. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these encounters is their implication that we are not always the observers in the natural world, but sometimes the observed. The feeling reported by multiple rangers of being watched by an unseen intelligence challenges our perception of ourselves as the dominant species, even in our most protected wilderness areas. Yellowstone National Park receives over 4 million visitors annually, most of whom remain in developed areas and never venture into the remote backcountry where these encounters occurred. Yet, the park's vastness, nearly 3,500 square miles of wilderness, ensures that there are always places where humans are merely visitors, transient presences in a landscape that has existed for millions of years before our arrival and will likely exist for millions of years after our departure. The rangers who experienced these phenomena serve as intermediaries between the civilized world of visitor centers and maintained trails and the untamed wilderness that exists beyond our understanding. Their encounters remind us that there are still mysteries in the natural world that defy our scientific knowledge and challenge our perception of reality. The documentation of these experiences, the official reports, the audio recordings, the photographs, serves not as answers, but as questions that future generations may be better equipped to address. For now, they remain as they were recorded. Unexplained phenomena that occurred in the forbidden zones of Yellowstone, witnessed by trained professionals who could not explain what they had seen and heard. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our understanding of these phenomena grows with each documented account, creating a clearer picture of the mysteries that still exist in the wilderness areas of America. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.